Historic Providence was the setting for the Middlesex County Museum and Historical Society spring fundraiser. We were excited to have Luna, a replica of a 1700s coastal cargo sloop, and crew present. The setting provided our guests with a wonderful opportunity for socializing and enjoying refreshments. Our hostess, Holly Horton, Executive Director of the Middlesex County Museum and Historical Society, welcomed everyone and introduced Jock, Bill, and Bob. Jock Collamore provided us with the story of building Luna, her use as an educational resource, and traveling the bay and coast promoting Middlesex County tourism. Bill Cawthorn, owner of Providence for almost 40 years, lovingly shared his and his family's devotion to the preservation and care of Providence. The Reverend Dr. Robert Pritchard provided the guests with the interconnectedness of 1700s church, politics, trade, and slavery.
We are truly blessed today to have this wonderful tent above our heads, providing the shade that's making this such a lovely event together. And we have Rappahannock Community College to thank. They had a huge fundraiser here yesterday with over 400 people. And they brought in over $100,000 for scholarship money for our local youth. So that is just absolutely fantastic. Cean and Bill Cawthorn, the owner of Providence here, graciously hosted that event, and they're hosting us today. So we really want to thank them also for their gracious hospitality. We also have joining us today on the water. I don't know how many of you were able to go down and see. The Luna is here, and I have Jock Collamore here, and he's going to talk to us a little bit about its history and the history of the tie into Middlesex County and how important the trading was on the water at that point in time.
Hey everyone, as Holly said, I'm Jock Collamore. I'm the president and CEO of the Colonial Seaport Foundation. Again, we'd like to thank the Cawthorns for having such a wonderful venue and allowing Luna to tie up at the dock. And I'd like to thank the Middlesex Museum up in Saluda. We're very excited to be able to work with the museum. We worked with the museum, the Deltaville Maritime Museum, and the Urbana Museum under the Museums of Middlesex. And we always do things with Urbana and we always do things with Deltaville, but our problem is Saluda's landlocked. And well, it's kind of hard to get a boat there. So we were at a Museums of Middlesex meeting a couple months ago. Marilyn was explaining the program that was going on down here, and I'm jumping up and down going, Marilyn, we're right around the corner. We can get there. So this has worked out just beautifully. And again, thank you to the sponsors for allowing us to occupy your dock. Luna is a reproduction colonial era trading sloop that has been under construction for the last 15 years. We launched her last year. And yesterday was a training day for us. We brought her from Broad Creek around up the Piankatank River. And yesterday we were very excited. We actually got her under full sail for the first time. And we were just amazed. We were just amazed with what we were seeing and the way that she handled. We've got several of our reenactors and boat crew here with us today, dressed up kind of funny. We've got a couple folks in our Luna t-shirts, our working shirts. We love talking about the boat, so if you see any of us around, please don't hesitate to stop and ask questions, and if time permits later on, please go down and take a look at the boat. Luna's float plan is pretty unique in that we're using her as a floating classroom, so we'll have students from on board, or from the region on board and in the area. We're also used as a marketing tool for the museums of Middlesex, which is our partners up in Saluda, down here in Deltaville, and in Urbana. We use her as part of the River Realm and the Middle Peninsula marketing. So we have those fine folks to thank as well. And one more thing that we're doing with her is we're actually reintroducing the colonial age trading routes to the region. Luna is set up as a cargo vessel, which means we'll be putting dry goods, commodities on board and being able to move between the historic ports in the region, such as Urbana, over to Irvington, down to Yorktown, the ports down in Hampton Roads, Hampton, Norfolk, Portsmouth. We can make it over to Cape Charles. We can go up the Eastern Shore. We can ultimately end up in Chestertown, Maryland, Annapolis, Baltimore, St. Mary's, and work all the historic ports. While we're doing that, we're going to be flying the Middlesex banner and the Museums of Middlesex banner, bringing that recognition back to the area. So it's a pretty involved program, and we're very, very excited to be able to bring that interest in the colonial heritage and the maritime heritage back to our home region. So again, thank you also very much for your support and allowing us into the venue today, and it's just a joy for us to be here and be at such a historic venue. And thank you also very much for letting me up here and listening to babble for a few minutes. So we'll get on to the main presentation. There you go.
I forgot to introduce myself. I apologize. I am Holly Morton. I am the director of the Middlesex County Museum. I have a background in advertising marketing and also in graphic design, and I have my master's in museum studies. So it's been fun to work with the museum and all of the aspects of sharing this great depth of history that Middlesex County has, from all the various stories of people that came through here, that settled here, all of their relatives, their descendants, their homes, the trading paths, the different types of interactions that we had at the Oyster Festival. I was talking about brick making with the kids. It's just so fascinating to see all the different aspects that brought people to Middlesex and kept them here. So we have a wonderful story to tell, and we are thrilled to be here today looking at a historic building, telling the story of settlement here over the years, and then the talking also with Providence would have been part of the trading that was going on, all of the growth that was going on. They were here very early in the development of Middlesex County. We have three sponsors today that we wanted to thank. We have Cynthia Lewis, we have Mark Matthews, and Dave and Marilyn South. So thank you very much. And again, we want to say again thank you for Cean and Bill Cawthorn for hosting us on their beautiful, beautiful property. Our main speaker today is the Reverend Dr. Robert W. Pritchard. I know him as Bob. He is on our board of directors. He is a vice president, and that's how I know him. His credentials are much more impressive than that. He's a professor emeritus of church history at the Virginia Theological Seminary and is the current vice president, as I said, of our Historical Society. Bob is a graduate of Princeton, also of Yale Divinity School and Emory University, and has deep family roots in Middlesex County. He is a former president of the Historical Society of the Episcopal Church and its author or editor of 10 different books. He's very prolific, sits on multiple boards that I'm also on. He likes to write. He always brings his computer with him. One of his books, A History of the Episcopal Church, was published in 91, 99, 2014, and the Spanish edition came out in 2022. He also is the author of A History of Church Schools in the Diocese of Virginia, Volume 1, which came out in 1999. So he is a person that is very detail-oriented. He is always noticing things, ways to pull history together from different angles, and looking at it from different perspectives of different types of people that would have been here in our county. He also sits, his family owns a historical property, and he earlier this year allowed a dig to happen there. And we were able to find and learn more about the Native Americans who were here so much earlier than we are. So I would like to welcome to the podium the Reverend Dr. Robert W. Pritchard, our Bob.
Is Bill speaking first?
Oh, I'm so sorry.
That's fine. I think.
I forgot something. I do apologize. Bill has graciously also told us that he would talk about his house. So we were, is he still? Where's he? He's coming around. Okay.
He's right here.
Oh, Bill, can you come up?
Really, your attorney's gonna applaud it.
Good afternoon. I'm Bill Cawthorn. My wife, Cean, and I bought Providence in 1984, 39 years ago. We were looking for a summer cottage, and we pulled up down the driveway and said, "This is not a summer cottage." And we bought it that week, and we have used it either as a summer home or a home since 1984. We've lived here, I guess, the last 12 years full time. Now a little bit about Providence. Providence was originally a 1,000-acre land grant from the King of England in 1642, and there's Bill Carroll's in the audience, and he's got documented research on all of this, and he knows much more about the land grants than I do. But from what I can make of it, it's 1642, the land grant coming in here. The home was built in 1760 or thereabout. People are saying 1757 to 1782, but there's a brick that you will be able to see on the back porch where they actually engraved 70 W and M 1760, and it's laid right above the top of the door. So we'll be able to see that. We are opening Providence, so you'll be able to tour the first floor if you want to. After the speech is over, it's pretty unique. A lot of it is between the white chimneys. It's old. It's the original home. The rest of it we've done in the last 40 years. So, but we try to keep true to the colors and keep it like it would have been in 1760. So it was William Morgan was the gentleman that built the home, supposedly, from what we can tell. Supposedly he was sent here to fight pirates on the Chesapeake Bay, which is, you don't think about it, pirates on the Chesapeake Bay. And so, but and it's gone from there. Anybody have any questions? If you do, just think of them. Ask me the questions as you go through tour the house. And welcome to Providence. We think it's the prettiest site on the north side of the Piankatank River. We believe it was, yes. There was another structure on here that I believe Gordon White mentions in his book that possibly was further down toward the point, toward Bland Point. But this was the main house. It was before, the Revolution. It was built before the Revolution.
Well, there was an earlier house, but it was much, much smaller.
Okay, and that was down on Bland Point. And you see things in reading. I guess history is all confused, and I never was much of a student, but this has been called the Dudley Plantation, Providence. It's been called many different things, and I don't know why. Bill Carroll might know why, but I don't. Why it was ever called the Dudley. I guess the Dudley's only for a short period of time, just like it's the Cawthorn house now. I don't know. No plantation, that's for sure. So, okay, we'll see all you guys coming. I hope you come through. And it's going to be, if a bunch of you come through, those that haven't seen the Luna ought to run down and see the Luna. It's quite a show. It's quite a show.
How many acres do you have here?
We have 15. Originally, it was 1,000. So it's got dwindled down and down. And it was back in the notes that Bill Carroll wrote, there was a division of 6 sisters that each got 136 acres. And that's where because you have Tim Blackwood's old home up here in the corner. That was part of a 136 acre parcel. The Wake property, which is here, was a 136 acre parcel. So it was all divided up into 6 equal parcels for 6 daughters. Any questions? All right, one's down to God.
I'm always a little afraid when I'm getting ready to talk about somebody else's house and they begin by correcting what I'm going to say. But in any case, I'd like to begin with something of a question and a general observation. And that is to say that brick homes for individuals in 1760 were still a fairly new and rare thing in the colony of Virginia. Now, there had been lots of big structures, but they were largely public buildings. St. Luke's Church in Isle of Wight County has made a variety of different claims, but I think the current claim is that perhaps in the 1680s, St. Luke's Church was built, and it claims to be the oldest brick church, a public building of brick which still stands. If you go into Williamsburg, you'll discover that the Capitol and the Governor's Palace and the Wren Building at the College of William and Mary are built all in the first decade of the 1700s, or begun at that point. And if you were to look at courthouses in Virginia, you'll find that perhaps the earliest courthouse of brick in Virginia is in King and Queen County, built about 1725. So there are big buildings. Christ Church Middlesex or Christ Church Saluda dates, the construction begins about 1710. Now, on the other hand, if you look at Williamsburg houses for single families, there are only 5 which are of brick that at least were recorded in historic buildings. 18th century houses of Williamsburg by Marcus Whiffen, his study, which was done for the Williamsburg Foundation. Of them, 3 are built after or in the 1750s or thereafter. 1 was built as an apartment building and then turned into a family home in the 1750s. And 1 perhaps was predated by a building which burned down in the 1750s, and it was built in the 1750s, so you don't know exactly how the brick building was that they claim to have been there first. But the point is, it's only in the second half of the 18th century that people began building brick homes for single families in Virginia with any frequency, and then it's a rare thing. Now, the original building of Providence, the center portion of the building we'll get a chance to look at today, was a story and a half over a English basement, that is a basement with windows out of the ground, and usually initially with a dirt floor and a fireplace, so that in cold weather you could do some cooking in that place without burning it down. The Middlesex Historic Buildings in Middlesex County book suggests that the building was built at a time when the land around it was at disagreement, somewhere between 95 and 200 acres. So some of the division of the land had divided, or perhaps the authors didn't understand, but I'm going to take them as saying it's a small house in order to pose a question. why would a family on a piece of property, which numbered at best in the hundreds, build a brick house in 1760? When there weren't many brick homes, and the ones that were being built in Middlesex County were built by the great families of Middlesex, like the Robinsons and the Wormleys, and others were building large homes, like Wilton were being built. They were built by families generally who owned property in terms of thousands of acres. Why? In this case, is a family with certainly well off, better than most, yet still, why was it possible for that building to be built here at that time? So I'm going to come back to that question, but I just want to pose it. It's a beautiful house. It's absolutely gorgeous the way it has been done, but it's not, the center portion is not equal in size to something like Hewitt or Lansdowne or Wilton. Though beautifully proportioned, looks very much like the house that William Byrd III built as his townhouse in 1770 in Williamsburg. So it's a very attractive building. So in order to look at that question, I want to back up and talk about tobacco, if you will. Because the money to build big buildings and the money to buy goods in the 18th century in Virginia came from the sale of tobacco. And indeed, tobacco was so important in the economy that in 1690, the colony's legislature directed that all clergy were to be paid their salary in pounds of tobacco. 1,600 acres, 1,600 pounds a year was the salary for a clergy person of any experience in any parish in Virginia beginning in 1690. Later on, it would also be directed that other officials of the county, court officials, would be paid in pounds of tobacco. And if you look before about 1760 in the parish vestry minutes of Middlesex County, you'll see that all of the accounting is kept in pounds of tobacco. Now, that looks like a very stable economy at first glance. So, you know, there were 3 members of the Yates family who served in succession from 1699 to 1767 as directors of Christ Church. The first one got paid 16,000 pounds of tobacco per year. The last one was still being paid 16,000 pounds of tobacco a year. It stayed the same during that whole period of time. With one exception, at one point, the people in Gloucester were trying to lure away a rector to go to one of the Gloucester parishes, and the vestry voted him a surcharge for a couple of years in order to convince him not to leave the parish. But back to 16,000 pounds of tobacco. It looks at a distance like an amazingly stable kind of economy. Over a period of almost 80 years, same salary year after year. And in a general way, at least until about 1760, it was, or until 1750, it was a relatively stable salary. Because what happens is, in some years, the price of tobacco would go up, but then it would come back down again. There was about an 8-year cycle, and if you just averaged out over about 8 years, you would end up having the same value. Your tobacco would be worth a little bit more per pound in 1 year, and it would go down the next. Particularly after 1730, this brought a stability of a kind. That was the year in which the General Assembly adopted the Tobacco Act of 1730, according to which every piece of tobacco that was going to be sold out of Virginia had to be inspected by the state to make sure you weren't putting clay in the bottom of the barrels. It was weighed, so you weren't spiking the barrel in some ways. And so when someone bought tobacco to be sold, an inspector would look at the tobacco and would give you a certificate saying that this was proper weight. It meant that people in England could know when the tobacco came that this was pretty much a guaranteed rate of tobacco, guaranteed quality of tobacco coming from Virginia, and it was inspected. There were 30 warehouses established across the colony where tobacco would be checked. And I don't know whether, I suspect, though I don't know for sure, in 1750, there was a customs house built in Urbana, and it didn't have enough room to store tobacco in it, but it may have had some role in seeing that the tobacco that went out of that harbor was good tobacco and didn't have, as they called it, trash tobacco mixed in. That was later converted into a family home and is now the sandwich house of the Montague family. But it was initially a customs house, and perhaps it's part of the system. People knew what quality they had, and the tobacco was more or less of good quality, and there was some variation, but it was a pattern which had some consistency to it. If you didn't get what you wanted in one year, perhaps the next year you'd get a little better tobacco, and so forth, as it repeated again and again. If you stayed in a parish or as a court appointee for more than 8 years, you generally got, over that period of time, a uniform salary of sorts. After 1750, however, the pattern began to break down. The 8-year cycle had more ups and downs. It was shortened to something like a 4-year cycle caused by drought, caused by war in England. The 7 Years' War in the 1756 to 63 meant that the English could not any longer turn around and take their Virginia tobacco and sell it to the French. And so the price of tobacco fell. There were bad droughts in the late 1760s, and the price went up and down. But another odd question I'll ask in a minute. Tobacco provided the funds to support the wealth of Virginia colony. Most of the brick homes which you find, that is, people who are well enough off to create a replacement for the wooden houses which had the bad habit of burning or wearing out, they didn't know about insect shields at that point in their foundations, and did not always have luck with weather. And shake shingles are not always perfect in keeping the water out. Wood buildings needed to be replaced. The brick buildings were able to last longer. But here's my question. If you look for brick houses of pre-colonial vintage in Middlesex County and in most of Virginia, most of them are in what was farmland. They're the house related to a plantation. They're surrounded by land. There is an exception to that, and that is Lansdowne, which is on Virginia Street in Urbana, not surrounded by a farm. If houses come from tobacco, why would you have an expensive 2-story pre-colonial brick house on Virginia Street in Urbana? It's convenient for the Oyster Festival, but I don't think they had one at that point. So, question. So that's the second house question. Why a brick house here on a farm which may, by some estimate, have been modest in size at that point, hundreds as opposed to thousands of acres? Why a house in the middle of Urbana? In 1982, a Australian historian with a wonderful Welsh name, Rhys Isaacs, wrote a book called The Transformation of Virginia, 1740 to 1790. And he called attention to the role of Scottish factors, who played a key role, he said, in the transformation of the economy in Virginia. Now, the way the system used to work before the Scottish factors showed up is all the tobacco raised in Virginia went to London, that was exported went to London. And big owners of land who were on the water would collect their tobacco and arrange to have it shipped to London, and wouldn't know what price they were going to get until it was sold. There was only one place to sell it, and there was limited ways to get it to England. If you were very wealthy, I suppose you could buy your own ship, but in general, you were indebted to the shipper and to the salesman in London. That can be moderately disastrous. If you think, imagine a bank account where you make a deposit and you don't know exactly how valuable it is for another 6 months. And in the meantime, you continue to make purchases for other things. After the union of England and Scotland at the beginning of the 18th century, Scots began to have some access to the places that had exclusive trade with England. And a group of Scottish people had a bright idea by the 1740s. Why don't we go to the colonies and buy tobacco and give people an alternative? Why don't we break up the London monopoly? And they did. And so a group of people, mostly who were Scots, came to Virginia and they set up stores throughout the colony, and they offered something that the English merchants did not. And they said, you bring tobacco in the door, we will pay you as soon as it arrives here. No waiting until it gets to England and then the ship comes back and tells you what it's worth. And not only that, if you want to buy something, we have happened to bring some items from England which are available on our shelves. And you can buy right away as soon as we pay you for the tobacco that you bring in. Now, at first, those factors set up their shops in places like Richmond and Petersburg and Norfolk and Fredericksburg and Alexandria. But in time, they began to spread out. At the time of the American Revolution, there were 2,000 factors roughly working in Virginia. So they spread out. And in the late 1750s or the early 1760s, a man by the name of James Mills, who had been working in Rappahannock, came to Urbana. And by the middle of the 1760s, he had a shop opened right across the street from the custom house, a tobacco factory, a tobacco warehouse, Scottish factor store. And suddenly people had an alternative. You not only could bring your tobacco to the English merchant, or if you had a small farm, it was even worse. What you did is you brought your tobacco to a big merchant, asked him to take it into England. The merchant didn't, the big landowner didn't know what he was going to be paid, and it was likely that he or she would take a cut when the payment came, and so you didn't know what it was, except you knew you would get less than the price that the guy with a big house got. But imagine being able to walk in a store where they paid you when you bought the tobacco in. By 1770, more tobacco was going from Middlesex County and from Virginia to Glasgow than to London, because they were offering better deals. Initially, this meant that Small farmers found it the advantage first because they were paying the double cut. They had to take the price given in London, then they had to take the percentage that was taken out by the local planter. So small farmers went there first, and then the big farmers. And it had the advantage of actually making it much easier to keep track of your own budget. When you were paid, you didn't have to wait 6 months to know what the value of your payment was. So the Scottish factors became very popular. And so here's the answer to one of the questions I posed, and that is, why is there a large brick house in the middle of Urbana? And the answer is, the Scottish factor built it. It wasn't because of a great plantation. It was tobacco money, but it was the industrious Scot who set up the factor in Urbana, who had the money to build the house. Later, the Lee family would. But James Mill was the creator of the house Lansdowne in the center of Virginia Street. And so he didn't have far to walk to work, did he? He was able just to walk down the street to the store, which was closer to the harbor, in order to purchase tobacco and to sell goods that had come from England. So another aside, I have not seen this specifically in people's account, but it is at least a good guess that there is an economic advantage for people who have small boats for commercial use when suddenly you have an explosion in things available for sale. Those things sold have to get to the Scottish factor stores. And undoubtedly, people bought some imported goods and took them elsewhere for sale as well. So small sloops that carried commercial cargo throughout the Chesapeake were also taking advantage of the presence of the Scottish factors. Now, Rhys Isaacs went on to argue that the presence of the Scottish factors led to the decline of the Church of England parishes and to the rise of Presbyterians, because the Church of Scotland is Presbyterian, and he reasoned that so long as you had no choice but take your tobacco to the big farmer, who is likely as not a member of the Church of England, you would go to his church because you were beholden to that family or person. But he said, when you had a choice, you would go to the church that the Scottish factor went to, who gave you a better deal and made it attractive. Now, I don't know whether that's in fact true. A lot of people have debated that, but I can say it was not true in the 1760s and 70s in Middlesex County, because the vestry of Christ Church was on the ball. And the vestry is the parish council name for the fact it used to meet in the minister's vesting room. So the vestry, as soon as Mr. Mills had set up his business in Urbana, nominated him to serve on the vestry and convinced him to become a member of the vestry himself. The next year, they convinced him to become senior warden or become one of the wardens. So the two wardens, which we now call junior and senior wardens, are the officers of the parish council of the vestry. And then the next year, the parish had someone with the responsibility of collecting the tithes of members of the parish, which were paid in tobacco. And they made James Mills the parish collector of tobacco. So one might have many reasons to join the Presbyterian Church, but in Middlesex County, it wouldn't have been to impress the factor, because you would find him as one of the wardens at Christ Church in Middlesex. It may be why there are not a lot of Presbyterian churches in this area, though there are Baptist and Methodist churches are in greater number. So another thought I have just forgot. Oh, okay. The success of the Scottish factors created some resentment in some quarters about Scottish immigrants. Now, it had arisen before. Virginia was not always hospitable to people who didn't come from England. In the case of this rise in the 1760s and 50s of the Scottish factors as they became more important, people displaced some of their anger. And so instead of getting mad at the factors themselves who had financial rewards to offer, they got mad at the clergy who were Scots. Now, the Scots in Virginia had been protected for a long time because the leader of the clergy in Virginia, that is the commissary or the man commissioned to be the leader of clergy in Virginia, happened to be a man named James Blair, who was born in Scotland. And he protected folks. But James Blair died in the 1740s, and he was replaced by an Englishman who immediately began complaining about Scots clergy. That was Commissary William Dawson, and he said that the Scots clergy you're sending seldom have, I fear, so great a regard for the church's interest as for their own, and that clergymen from Oxford and Cambridge, like Mr. Dawson, would be much more appreciated in the colony. So there was a beginning of a kind of anti-Scots attitude. Clergyman Isaac Gaburn of Lunenburg Parish said that clergy from Scotland were miserably ignorant of the true faith and grounds of the Christian life, and even unfit to be partakers of the sacraments that they themselves administer. So there's a kind of rising unhappiness. It's in part, I think, anger at the new kids on the block who are upsetting the economy, but you go after the easy target, which would be the number of Scots Episcopalians who are serving in Church of England parishes. So just another story. Earlier in the century, there is a Huguenot who was born in Ireland, who then became a clergyman in Virginia named Lewis Lackney. And Lewis Lackney was the rector of the Episcopal Church, the Church of England parish, in the east side of Essex County, so right on the Middlesex border. You may recognize his name because his daughter, one of his daughters, married Abraham Montague, and ever since there have been Montagues with Lackney in their name, either Robert Lackney or other arrangements with Lackney as a name. But he had a story that was told of him and he liked to tell. And he was a believer in abstinence from alcohol. Not entirely popular with all his parishioners. And his parishioners tried to figure out how to get rid of him. They began to complain to other people that his accent was so strong that you couldn't understand a word that he said. And when he was in the pulpit, he said things we just could make no sense of. So Lackney one day saw one of the complaining parishioners going past on the way to a bar. And he said to him, "It looks like a hot day and a good day for a drink." And the man immediately responded, "Yes." And Parson Lackney said, "You know, it's funny. When I ask you to live a moral life, you can't hear me. But when I tell you to sin, you understand immediately." And he then would repeat that when people gave him a hard time. I think some of the Scots clergy had that same experience of people being critical of saying we would much prefer someone English rather than a Scot. And I think it's kind of, in some ways, a side effect of having the clergy, of having the rise of a group of people who changed the economic system to some degree of the Virginia colony. So back again to Providence. One of the things that people discovered was that in looking at the finances of people in the 1860s and 70s, 1760s and 70s, was that those people who sold all their tobacco to the Scottish factors were in better economic shape when the economy began to go up and down than those who sold their money directly by the ships to London. They had a better idea of what they were working with. They were better able to shape an economy. And that may be why, if this in fact was a house built by someone on 200 acres of land, why this house was started and completed in the 1760s, but a great house like Lansdowne was started in the 1770s and ultimately completed in the 1820s. It took a while for those in the big houses to get their finances in order. There was another reason, and it had to do with the spending houses of the gentry in Virginia. Apparently, there were diarists in England, in London in the 1760s and 70s, who argued that if you really want to know what the newest styles and the fanciest goods to own are, you ought to go to Virginia, because the gentry in Virginia are subscribing to British magazines and they're buying all the newest fashions for their clothes and the newest accoutrements for their house, even before most of us in London get them. I don't know whether that was precisely true, but it is the case that between about 1765 and 1775, the debt of the landed gentry in Virginia doubled, to the point that more money was owed to the English merchants than all of the goods that they sold in 2.5 years. They liked what they saw. They made the mistake of assuming if your tobacco brought a good price in 1 year, it would bring that the next year. And with that long gap between delivery and sale, they got deeper and deeper in debt. At the time of the American Revolution, the Americans in Virginia, who were something like 20% of the population of the American colonies, owed about 45% of the debt that American colonists owed to England. Virginians were outspending everybody else, and though some of that belonged to people of small holding, a lot more of it belonged to people of great houses. So the story of the 1760s and 1770s, late 1750s, is that the gentry were trying to figure out how to squeeze more money out of tobacco and make sure that the money that did come came to them and not from other people. Now, one of the expenses of the gentry was the tithe that was collected. It was a tax per person, but it wasn't for everybody. The tax was based on every white male over 16 in a household, and every enslaved person or indentured servant over 16, whether male or female. And then there was some amount of tobacco per person that was to be paid. And it ranged over the years between about 25, 22, and about 50 pounds of tobacco per person. The clergy said that the people of modest income delivered good tobacco on time, and the people of great wealth, who were making use primarily of enslaved labor, had a much bigger amount to deliver, and they tried to fob off their worst tobacco and took the longest period of time to pay. So the gentry are trying to figure out various ways to avoid the payment of the tithe or to make it smaller. First step, 1748, the collector of the tithes was paid 10% of the tithes collected as a fee. The legislature, which was more representative of the upper class than of people of modest income, cut that in 1748 to 6%. So if you pay less to the collector, everybody gets a slightly lower bill, and the pounds per person are decided each year in advance for the next year. So every October, they decide what will be due when the harvest comes for the following year. So that's step one. In 1755, they took two further steps. In 1755 and 1758, there were banned harvest. And the price of tobacco, which ranged between about 1.5 penny a pound to about 2 pennies a pound, going up and down depending on the harvest year and the weather and other things in the market in England. In the 1755 and 58, there were banned harvest because of the scarcity, the price went up. 1758, in some cases, the price reached 6 pennies a pound. So that's a pretty good increase over 1.5 penny a pound in that point. So the legislature looked at that, and the head of the legislature, or the chair, the Speaker of the House of Burgesses, was John Robinson of Middlesex and of King and Queen. He was born in Hewick. He grew up, he also had a farm in King and Queen, and in the legislature, he represented King and Queen. And under his leadership, he was the Speaker of the House forever. He was the Speaker of the House from 17, I'm not seeing. He perhaps from 1738 to 1765. So it was a 1738 to 1765. He held that position a long time. So what he tried to do was to take advantage of that office to help people of his own class. And so he was a supporter of legislation which said, hereafter, for the next harvest year, anybody who is paid in pounds of tobacco, like court officials and clergy, will be paid 2 pennies a pound regardless of the actual sale price. Now, they were smart. They made it only a 1-year interval because who knows, the next year the price might drop down to 1.5 pennies and they would be stuck paying people at a higher rate. So they cut the rate down to 2 pennies. Clergy didn't complain very much in 1755. When they did it again in 1758, clergy were quite unhappy because that was the year the price went up to 6 pennies a pound. And so people were being paid in tobacco with the equivalent of 1/3 of what the actual sale price was. A group of clergy got together, about half of the Church of England clergy in the colony. They asked their commissary, the successor now to Dawson, who is there, to go to London and complain to the Parliament about what was going on. One of the people who signed was a Scot clergyman who come to the colony by the name of Patrick Henry. Now, we're going to hear about his nephew of the same name. So they commissioned someone to go to England. They go to England. They enlist the support of the Bishop of London, who says this is absolute heresy and thievery. You can't do this to officials of the state, and you can't do this to Church of England clergy. And they come back, with an act from the British Parliament saying the 2 penny acts are null and void. You can't do this. This is wrong. But they had expired. And so the only thing that clergy could do is they could go to the court and sue for damages. And so a clergyman in Hanover had a test case. He went to the court. He was a James Maury, and of Hanover. He went to the court and said, I am owed the value of the tobacco I should have been paid in for these 2 years. And the court agreed that he had been done damages and he deserved restitution. So the parish hired a young, relatively inexperienced clergyman and failed tobacco merchant, farmer by the name of Patrick Henry, the nephew of the guy who'd asked to have the act annulled. And he was eloquent. And he declared many things about why this was wrong and the act could not be overturned. And the jury awarded James Maury 1 pence in damages. Still, the legislature had won, if you will. John Robinson and the wealthy people had won. They were able to manipulate clergy, but they couldn't do it again. The Parliament had already outlawed that, and so they couldn't come back in 1763 or 1764 and do the same trick again. They needed some other tricks in the book. So matters even got worse for the rich people because in 1764, people in England were having financial trouble, and they passed a new currency act, according to which those nice letters issued in Virginia, which said this is worth the value of 100 pounds of tobacco or for some other amount, they were declared no longer to be valid unless written on special paper approved by the Parliament. And so the whole colony was turned upside down. All the people who owed money, all the people who depended on those certificates, discovered that they no longer had valid currency unless they paid an additional tax to the people in London. Now, Patrick Henry, the nephew, the lawyer, writing on his reputation for having won against the Parsons and the Parsons cause, got elected to the House of Burgesses in 1764. And there was at that time a decision, I guess he showed up in 1765. John Robinson's friends had got together and they said, what we have to do is we have to have an act here to bail out all the rich people who are sunk by this recent act in London. And so we need to have some rescue act. And they drafted it and it looked like it might work. And then Patrick Henry began to denounce that in the legislature and it was defeated. And then, incidentally, he went on to say something about the Stamp Act and other British actions in that same legislature several days later. So he's the firebrand, but he has again created problems for the very rich who thought a government bailout was just around the corner. By the next year, John Robinson begins to take action on his own. He not only was the Speaker of the House of Burgesses, he was also the exchequer, the treasurer of the colony of Virginia. And one of his jobs was to collect and burn old money when the English printed new bills. Now, he hadn't figured out any way to convince the legislature to have a rescue act. either in anticipation of that decision or in frustration that his rescue act was not approved, he began to take some of the money that was supposed to be burned and keep it, and then make loans to his friends who were in trouble. And he did it when they began to make accounting to the tune of 100,000 pounds sterling. This was big time embezzling of government money and lending to your friends. And he lent it to all sorts of people like Carter Braxton, the signer of the Declaration, who spent some time in Middlesex County, William Byrd III of Williamsburg, who built a house much like this one as his, not his country estate, but as his town home in Williamsburg. Lewis Burrell of Gloucester County, who was another one of the great families. People did not figure out what he'd done until John Robinson died the next year. And then his poor successor tried to figure out the accounts for the colony of Virginia, and they realized what happened. One of the reasons that Hewick took so long to complete its current shape is that the state of Virginia came after his relatives to try to recover some of the money that was taken. And it would take for the next 20 years into the 1780s before members of the family had paid at least the amount that the state of Virginia would accept, which probably was less than the amount of money taken. Now, I'm going to talk about slavery in a minute, and then I'm going to come back to that big planter debt. One of the stories about tobacco is that in the first decade of the 18th century, people in large farms, the first family, the gentry of Virginia, began to move from cultivation of tobacco by family members and tenants and indentured servants to the large-scale importation of enslaved labor to do that work. And in the 1730s and 40s, large numbers of enslaved people were brought to the colony of Virginia. In the first 100 years of enslaved persons in Virginia, less than, according to the University of Maryland's excellent database, less than 2,000 persons were transported to the colony in each period of 25 years. The number rose from 1725 on 13-fold to 25,000 people who were brought into Virginia. And then in the period from 1750 to 1771, that number rose to 73,000. So there was a massive expansion of slavery in the Virginia colony for the purpose of cultivation of tobacco. Maryland has done just a wonderful job. They've found all the records of ships of which the English had knowledge that brought enslaved people to the colonies of Virginia and elsewhere. And so they often can tell you where the ships went and where they came from. But if you look on the locations in Virginia, the earliest outpouring of transportation of enslaved people in that period in the 18th century when the number began to grow was to the York River. And then, beginning in about the 1720s, the number of people transported to the Rappahannock began to grow. Between 1726 and 1739, 39 ships brought enslaved, 21 ships, some with up to 250 people on board, came to the Rappahannock Valley. Now, one of the things that people have noticed when they look at the institution of slavery in Virginia is that two things seem to happen together in Virginia in the 1770s. The landowners, in many ways, the big landowners were the most conservative of people. I mean, they would have liked to go on back to the days of knights and lords and ladies, and they lived as if they were kings and queens, often in large estates with lots of attendants. But they turned to be in favor of the American Revolution. And people have wondered about that and thought about explanations for why that might be the case over the years. And I want to mention just two of the observations of two of the explanations about that same observation. That is, people agreed, would you expect George Washington, who was in a big plantation and in which there was enslaved labor, to be to be a revolutionary? Would you expect Carter Braxton, who was from a family with a large plantation, wouldn't you expect them to be more conservative? Well, in some cases it's true. Some members of the Robinson family fought for the British. One of the stories I've always found interesting is the guy who convinced Benedict Arnold to leave the American side and become a British spy was a Robinson who married someone from New York, and they met in his house and had something to do with that famous story of an American who abandoned the cause to support the British. But by and large, the gentry in Virginia were in favor of the American Revolution. So here are two explanations. Back in 1985, a man by the name of T.H. Breen said that in the 1770s, Virginians were extremely mad at their huge debts to English merchants. Some of them just got so despondent they didn't know what to do. On New Year's Day of 1777, William Byrd III, who had a huge debt, shot himself in the head because he could not figure any other way out. So some just fell into total despondency. But others made a turn and began to connect their debt not simply with their own desire to buy things that the English were selling, not just their poor planning on prices, but began to see their whole economic system in which they were participating as a kind of tyranny on the part of the British, and began to see it as a political cause. And so to make the most cynical reading of what T.H. Breen had to say is the revolutionaries were very anxious for a revolution which could lead them out of debt to the British, who would no longer be their masters. Now there's another explanation which is made, and that was more recently suggested by Christopher Leslie Brown, who I believe may now be at Harvard University, but a brilliant historian. He argued in a book called Moral Capital that as Americans got upset about the British Stamp Act and other things, they began to call the British tyrannical, taking their rights away, They talked about their slavery to British merchants and other things. And the British Board of Trade turned around and said, "Who are you to talk about slavery when you are a people who enslave African Americans?" And the Americans, this is where I think that Brown is just brilliant. He goes back and looks at their literature. They were sort of stuck in a position where they needed some moral capital for their own arguments. They needed something. They turned around and they then said, "Oh, we're not in favor of slavery. If you look at the list, where did all those boats come from that enslaved people reached Virginia? Almost all of them came from Liverpool. Who made the money for the transportation of people? People from Liverpool." And the Virginia legislature took leadership in banning the further importation of enslaved people in the 1760s. And then Delaware, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, New York, other colonies began to do the same thing. And the British legislature, the Parliament, which claimed to have rights over all laws in the colonies, invalidated all of those acts. And so the Americans got some, if you will, positive position in this debate about a terrible institution. If you look at what happened at the Revolution, there took place what a historian called Zilversmith called the first emancipation. All the states that eliminated slavery before the American Civil War did so between 1776 and 1830 as part of an effort to take seriously that moral argument against slavery that was being advanced by American apologists. In Virginia, that step forward was only a small step forward, but the state made it possible for individual enslavers to emancipate their enslaved people. 3 people did that in large measure: Richard Randolph, George Washington, Robert Carter III. Interestingly, another thing that's going on, the people most likely to emancipate their enslaved persons are the people who give up on tobacco. By 1765, George Washington wouldn't grow tobacco anymore. He was convinced of his argument, it's a losing game. All we do is spend money. It's highly labor intensive. We can't, we're simply captive of a market in the UK, which never makes us any money, but you all seem to do fine. And so Robert Carter II stopped growing wheat, stopped growing tobacco and introduced wheat. And if you kind of line up some of the early people to say, this tobacco culture has not been good for anybody, a small portion of that are the people who turn around and say, I can't have anything to do with slavery anymore. There's my favorite story of somebody who did that wasn't actually a plantation owner, but he was a teacher and a lawyer by the name of George Wythe. And there's a George Wythe house in Williamsburg, and there's a town called Wytheville, which is related to that family. George Wythe was the law school at William and Mary. He was the first law school professor in the United States in a college. He was the head of the of the Court of Chancery, and twice he ruled against the legality of keeping people in slavery. There were particular occasions and his decisions were overturned, but he was plunking away. And then later in life, he had an enslaved person in his family whom he taught to read and write, educated, and then emancipated, and then left in his will the provision that his estate would go to one who had been his bondsman. George Wythe was then poisoned by his great nephew who wanted his estate, who also poisoned the young man. Who was to be heir of the estate. So there, I mean, on some level, it looked like an obvious thing to do simply to free people who were enslaved, and some people did that. Though often in their wills, so they enjoyed the fruit of everybody else's labor until they died. But Christopher Leslie Brown's point is that this grew out of people trying to shape an answer to the British in the question of taxes and in the question of who was enslaving and who was free and who was to blame. And some people took it seriously, including judges in 2 states who simply banned slavery, said, the Constitution says you can't do that. Or the Declaration of Independence says we don't do that. All people are created equal. And so they stopped. And then a whole group of states that adopted a system also proposed in Virginia, though not adopted, of gradual emancipation, which was to take the rules for a long apprenticeship and simply applied it to enslaved people so that you owe your labor to somebody until you reach a certain. I'm sorry, it was after the fly and not the microphone, but in any case, that when you reach 25 or 28 on July 4th, you would become a free person. And Pennsylvania and New Jersey and New York adopted that system, Connecticut. It took a while for that system to circulate through, but the first emancipation came in part out of this debate about who was to blame and who needed to amend their ways at the time of the American Revolution. So I have some time, I think. Do we have time for questions, or have I overtalked? Okay. Are there any questions, corrections? Bob?
I've always been under the impression that Ralph Wormley of Rosehill owns the entire site of the town of Urbana. Lansdowne was built by Ralph Wormley III of Rosehill when it was a 1,000-acre plantation that surrounded it. And the Wormleys only gave or granted 60 acres for the creation of the town of Urbana. So Lansdowne should have been a plantation from the get-go, because 60 acres is a relatively small amount of that 1,000 that the Wormleys, I believe, owned on the town side of the creek.
Do you know the date of the Urbana grant?
Urbana was authorized, I think, in 1680, but nothing happened there until the Wormleys agreed to cooperate, and that was beginning in the 18th century, around 1704 or 5.
What the Lansdowne, according to the Middlesex County Houses book, was not built until the 1770s. So they may have been the 1760s.
Which is earlier, I think it's 1740.
Yeah. So in general, I think a general point would be this. Bob, if you didn't hear, is asking a question about Lansdowne in the middle of Urbana. Well, that was once part of a bigger estate. And there probably was a house there from early on. Generally, brick houses don't spring up from nothing. They are replacing wood structures that were there before. And so, and that happened at the time after 1760 when James Mills came to town, at least according to some estimates.
Quite likely, Lansdowne was not built all at once, but the earliest part of it, I think, goes back to 1740 at least. And I bought a parcel that was once part of Lansdowne in 1976, and I did the title search for that parcel at the time, and that's the basis for my remarks right now. Something was built in 1747, and that became my law office in Urbana. And 1976.
That's across the street. Yeah.
Across the street from, but owned by the same chain of title that Lansdowne on the plantation outside of the street was owned by back at least 1747. That's why I think Lansdowne was there before they built it, but I think it's the plantation overseas.
Thank you. I'm from a family with cousins and father and son and brother-in-laws who are lawyers, but I'm not. So I have not done the title search of Lansdowne. Gordon,
You want to mention something, Judge, was?
I don't know that.
His father?
His father was the judge, who probably found him very persuasive. So that was a really in-house argument, wasn't James Henry presiding while Patrick Henry argued against a cause that Uncle Patrick Henry had been in favor of? It sounds like Virginia. Other corrections, I will, we have from Bill the offer of a tour of the house so that we can see that. I'll be glad if there are not other questions, simply to stay here if somebody wants to chat further. And I think as Luna sailed, it's still there.
Luna is still here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bob. We all want to He always amazes me. Yes, Gordon.